This is the Mop-Up. I'm David Feldman in New York City. Thank you for joining me on today's program. You may not agree with Donald Trump's decision to bomb Iran on Saturday. You may agree with it, but I'm going to point out why he is, in fact, now a war criminal. Whether or not you approve of his decision, I'm going to spell out why he is now an international war criminal. So, first, we have reports that Iran has launched missiles at American soldiers stationed in Qatar. The foreign minister of Qatar saying, do not worry, it's all under control. France 24 reporting that no other American military bases in the Middle East have been attacked. Now, 40,000 to 50,000 U.S. troops are stationed throughout the area. We've got 10,000 troops, American troops, are in Qatar. They were under attack earlier today, and 13,500 Americans are stationed in nearby Kuwait, 3,500 in the United Arab Emirates, 2,500 are still left in Iraq, 2,000 in Syria, 3,000 in Jordan, and a couple hundred in Oman. The New York Times reporting that Iran notified Qatar that the missile strikes were coming beforehand in order to avoid casualties. So far, there are no reports of casualties. And I said at the top, Qatar is saying things are under control. Speaker Mike Johnson just said this was expected. It doesn't look like this is going to escalate. France 24 reporting that Iran said the number of bombs it dropped on Monday was equal to the number of bombs the United States dropped Saturday on Iran. While the number is equal, the tonnage doesn't come close. Our bunker busters weigh 30,000 pounds each. We dropped more than a dozen of them. The New York Times reporting that Qatar's missile defense shield was able to knock the Iranian missiles out of the sky Monday evening. There are those who are saying this is not a major escalation, that Iran is simply trying to save face by responding to America's attack that took place on Saturday. You might remember back in April of 2024, Israel attacked the Iranian embassy in Syria, killing 16 people, including high-level commanders in the Iranian military. So this was back in April of 2024, and Iran, in order to save face, had to respond. 13 days later, Iran responded by launching a wave of missile and drone attacks on Israel. Israel's Iron Dome successfully knocked all of those incoming missiles and drones out of the sky. A 7-year-old Bedouin girl was injured in Israel, and 31 other Israelis required medical treatment, but nobody died. And Joe Biden, who was president in April of 2024, immediately called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and said, take the win. You got the win. Those were the exact quotes from Joe Biden. Take the win. You got the win. Biden said, you launched the missile strike on the Iranian embassy in Syria. You killed some of Iran's top leaders. They had to respond in order to save face. You knew they were going to respond. This is a kabuki dance. You knocked their missiles out of the sky. You knocked their drones out of the sky. Nobody died. Take the win. Do not respond. And they didn't. Israel didn't respond because Joe Biden was president. In January of 2020, after Trump assassinated Iran's most beloved general, Qasem Soleimani, while Soleimani was in Iraq, Iran told the United States, literally told the United States, we have to respond. So 5 days later, Iran launched airstrikes on American soldiers stationed in Iraq. No soldiers were killed, but it is now believed 110 American soldiers suffered traumatic brain injuries from those attacks. So it is generally believed Iran contacted the United States through back channels to let them know the attacks in January of 2020, they're on their way. We have to save face. We have to show the world we fight back. The same way it is generally believed right now that Iran contacted Israel in April of 2024, telling them attacks are on the way. We have to save face because of what you did to the Iranian embassy in Syria. And we know for a fact Iran contacted Qatar on Monday to tell them attacks are on the way. We want you to know to avoid casualties. So a lot of this, especially when you have diplomats, a lot of this is street theater. A lot of this is allowing Iran to save face. But now we have Donald Trump as president, who took to social media on Monday calling for regime change in Iran. This just hours after his Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, told reporters that Saturday's airstrikes on 3 nuclear installations were one-offs intended solely to end Iran's nuclear ambitions, and in no way were they intended to topple the current leadership. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt walking back Trump's regime change statement, insisting the president was only raising the question, asking why, after my successful precision bombings, why won't the Iranian people rise up now? So, in all fairness, the headline we woke up to on Monday was Trump calls for regime change in Iran. In his defense, the actual tweet was, quote, if they refuse to engage in diplomacy moving forward, why shouldn't the Iranian people rise up against this brutal terrorist regime, unquote. So he's not so much calling for regime change as he is suggesting it. As for diplomacy, Iran has been engaging in diplomacy with the United States before, during, and after Saturday's airstrikes. Responding to Donald Trump's calls for Iran to return to the negotiating table, Iran's UN ambassador Amir Saeed Iravani said, quote, how can Iran return to something it never left? Iran's ambassador made those comments during the UN Security Council's emergency session on Sunday. He went on to accuse Trump of launching the bombing campaign in order to bring an end to diplomacy. Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, is in hiding and has remained silent for fear any communications he makes would tip his location to Israeli intelligence, resulting in his assassination. He did, however, through social media, Sunday say Israel's and now the United States attacks will not end his nation's nuclear programs. Iran's supreme leader then promised more attacks on Israel, which continued into Monday as Israel confirms 8,000 were without power after a series of Iranian airstrikes pounded southern Israel. There are reports that the Ayatollah has written a letter to Russian leader Vladimir Putin asking for assistance. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi met with Putin in Moscow on Monday. The Iranian foreign minister was meeting with European leaders in Switzerland on Thursday, hoping diplomacy would prevent Trump's attack. On Friday, the Iranian foreign minister was in Turkey, trying to jumpstart more talks with America. The United States bombed on Saturday, and Iran's foreign minister immediately flew to Moscow. On yesterday's show, I reported rumors that Putin was thinking of providing Iran with nuclear weapons. I discounted those rumors as far-fetched because it's hard to imagine any nuclear power like Russia wanting to give one of its neighbors a nuclear weapon, even if Iran is one of Russia's strongest allies. So I dismissed that as a rumor, but we are now getting confirmation that Dmitry Medvedev, he was Russia's president, you might remember. He now serves as deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, but he was once Russia's president, and he is now saying that Russia is prepared to share Iran's nuclear arsenal. Russia is now prepared to share its nuclear arsenal with Iran. He's saying we are prepared to give Iran nuclear war-tipped missiles. Now, Medvedev is not Putin. At one point, before Russia got rid of term limits, Medvedev was Putin's placeholder. He would serve as president until Putin could run again. So it's still far-fetched to believe Russia would violate international law by providing Iran with nuclear-tipped missiles. And when has Russia ever violated international law? Ask the Ukrainians. They never violate international law. So Russia is an interesting component right now because since their illegal invasion of Ukraine, Iran has served as Putin's staunchest ally, providing Russia with drones to fight in Ukraine. Iran makes very effective drones, and then Iran sold the technology to Russia, so Russia could manufacture Iranian drones domestically. Iran has one nuclear energy facility. It's the Bushehr nuclear power plant located in southern Iran, built with Russia's assistance. And to help maintain it, 200 Russian scientists are working there. They always work there. So there is a connection, a nuclear connection that goes way back between Iran and Russia. So while Putin himself has said, I don't plan to provide Iran with any nuclear weapons, during Monday's meeting with Iran's foreign minister, he did say the Iranian people can count on Russia for support. Putin also called Trump's missile attacks unprovoked aggression, saying there were no grounds or justification for them. On yesterday's show, I suggested Putin plays chess. In the lead up to the American airstrikes on Iran, while Trump was deliberating whether or not to strike Iran, Putin said, I'm staying out of this. He only offered to serve as a mediator. Remember this? He said, I can mediate peace before you go in there, Donald. He then added, we offered Iran our missile defense system earlier in the year, but now it's too late. There's nothing we can do for them. And then Trump launched his attack. Putin plays chess. Was he tricking Trump into invading, attacking Iran? I have no doubt Putin wants the United States stuck in another Middle East quagmire because that makes it even more unlikely for Republicans to greenlight weapons for Ukraine. Did Putin trick Trump into attacking Iran? What do I know? I know nothing. And I suspect we're way past Putin having to trick Trump into doing something. I think we're now at the point where Trump takes orders from Putin, but he also takes orders from Netanyahu, so I don't know. I just know strategically it's in Putin's best interest to get America stuck in the Middle East. Trump is calling Saturday's attack, quote, a spectacular military success. He then declared Iran's nuclear enrichment plants, quote, have been completely and totally obliterated, which means they weren't. If Trump is saying they were obliterated, they weren't. In fact, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, is now telling reporters, quote, It's too soon to assess whether Iran still possesses nuclear capabilities. Well, maybe the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff isn't sure if Saturday's airstrikes were a success, but Israel is sure that they weren't a success. That is why Israel launched additional attacks on the Fordo nuclear enrichment facility on Monday. Israel saying the attacks that they made Monday were necessary to obstruct tunnel access to the Fordo facility. Now, we were told, Trump was told, everything came down to Fordo. He was told, we were told, that you destroy Fordo, you set Iran's nuclear program back 2 to 3 years. We were told that Fordo was buried deep inside a mountain and that Israel couldn't reach it. Only the United States had those 30,000-pound bunker busters that could penetrate that encasement. So, Saturday, 6 B-2 stealth bombers dropped 12 bunker busters on Fordo. Before Saturday's attack, I told you military experts were advising Trump that his bunker busters might not be enough. And they were advising that after those bunker busters, you might have to drop a small tactical nuclear weapon down there to finish the job. You might remember I said using a small tactical nuclear weapon kind of defeats the whole point of the attack. We're hitting Iran to forestall a nuclear holocaust, not trigger one. Trump was warned. The bunker busters are probably not going to do the trick. He launched them anyway. I quoted Major General Randy Manner, warning that the bunker busters would make for good television, an opportunity for Donald Trump to talk tough and make us feel daddy is keeping us safe. General Randy Manner warned, it's doubtful. This is before the bunker busters were dropped. He said it's doubtful dropping bunker busters would be enough. So we dropped 12. And apparently, despite Donald Trump calling it a success, Israel had to go in the next day and keep fighting, keep going into Fordo. Not a success. Rafael Grossi heads the International Atomic Energy Agency. He's the chief inspector. Before Israel launched its airstrikes on Iran, early in June, Grossi warned that Iran was being non-compliant. He said that while Iran was allowing his scientists to inspect each nuclear facility at least once a day, Grossi said his inspectors said Iranian scientists were not entirely forthcoming. He said, for a nation that doesn't have a nuclear weapon, Iran has the world's most enriched uranium. He then stated that he believed if Iran wanted to make a nuclear bomb, it could do so in less than a month. And this was the very first time in 20 years that that the UN's nuclear watchdog, this was the first time in 20 years that the UN's nuclear watchdog, talked so menacingly about Iran's nuclear program. So it gave Netanyahu a little license to launch the attack. It was still an illegal attack, but when the UN, I keep calling Iran the UN, when the UN's nuclear watchdog says Iran is not being as compliant as it used to be, Netanyahu, who's been itching to attack Iran for 30 years, struck. Grassi said, the UN inspector said, Iran does not have a nuclear bomb. After Israel launched its attacks on Iran, I guess it was like 11 days ago, Grassi, the UN inspector, said it is now impossible to inspect Iran's nuclear facilities. And he said, I have no idea what happened to that enriched uranium. He does believe, however, that in anticipation of the U.S. airstrikes, the uranium was moved out of Fordo. As for the U.S. attacks on Saturday, Grassi is now saying there was very significant damage to Fordo, but he said it's impossible to determine how much damage there actually was. Grassi said he's confident that the Buster bombs destroyed the centrifuges deep down inside Fordo. He said centrifuges are highly sensitive to any type of vibration, which is why one of the reasons you put the facility underground. Of course, they did have an earthquake as well. Grassi said the last time he inspected Fordo, there were about 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, and Iran will be in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty it signed unless it accounts for its entire stockpile of uranium and allows inspectors safe access to that Fordo facility. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, yes, his first name is Israel, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz, telling reporters Israeli airstrikes intensified on Monday as missiles targeted Iran's military headquarters, the Fordo nuclear facility, and a clock in Tehran that was counting down the number of days until Israel was destroyed. Iran reporting Israel hit Tehran's Evin prison, which the American media describes as a notorious jail for political prisoners and human rights abuses. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz later saying Israel did attack that prison, which he said interred enemies of the Iranian regime. Calls for negotiations between the United States and Iran, negotiations between Israel and Iran continue. Russia's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia now saying Trump's bunker busters, quote, opened a Pandora's box. Iran's UN ambassador Amir Saeed Eravani called Trump's bombing campaign, quote, a clear and flagrant breach of international law. Was Saturday's attack on Iran a violation of international law? And if it is, that makes Donald Trump a war criminal. Whether or not a lot of us believe Iran can't have a nuclear bomb. I don't want Iran to have a nuclear bomb, but I believe in the rule of law. Let's start with the American law, okay? Brianna Rosen, Tez Brisman, and Nimi Garami write over at Just Security. It's a great website. I really recommend Just Security. And they say that war-making powers are vested inside the legislative branch. According to the Constitution, Trump needed a declaration of war before he was legally authorized to bomb Iran. They write the nature and the justification for the bombing campaign that took place on Saturday. They say because it escalated the fighting, not end it, it escalated it, that makes the airstrikes, quote, war in the constitutional sense, unquote, and therefore it required explicit congressional approval. Now, that approval, let me clarify this, because some of you wrote in accusing me of not understanding the War Powers Resolution. So, that approval comes in the form of a war declaration, or more likely, a war authorization. A war authorization. Our two wars in Iraq under Daddy Bush and then George W. Bush, Those two wars required two separate war authorizations from Congress. Both those war authorizations have expired. So what are 2,500 soldiers still doing in Iraq? Well, there is the war authorization that was passed in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and that is still in place. Based on that war authorization, we can station all these soldiers in Qatar, Iraq, back in Iraq. I listed the 40 to 50,000 soldiers stationed throughout the Middle East. That the legal justification for this is the war authorization passed right after 9/11, and it's still in place. The original intent of that war authorization was to give George W. Bush permission to attack Afghanistan or any other country that allegedly assisted al-Qaeda in launching the attacks on 9/11. That war authorization is still in place, and it's been broadly interpreted by every president since George W. Bush, so they could include all terrorist organizations associated with al-Qaeda to justify airstrikes or military invasions. Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and Trump again, they all cite this war authorization dating back to the week after 9/11 to justify any bombing campaign around the world. And they do this simply by claiming the targets were somehow linked either to al-Qaeda or 9/11. So, Donald Trump, as we all know by now, doesn't believe in constitutional niceties. He hasn't yet bothered to explain the legal justification for Saturday's attack. There is no legal justification. He's a war criminal. He's got his own doctrine, and that is, it's legal because I said so. That doesn't hold up in court, although with this Supreme Court, who knows? Okay, the War Powers Resolution, I've been talking about that. It passed in 1973 to make sure Vietnam never happened again. According to the War Powers Resolution, a president can commit troops overseas for 90 days to fight a war, but after 90 days he will require a declaration of war from Congress, or he has to bring the soldiers home. Now, I've talked about war authorizations, which are different from declarations of war. The president can, before committing troops, get a war authorization from Congress, which allows him to then commit our troops overseas if and when the president sees fit. Again, I've talked about the Iraq war, the two Iraq war authorizations, and the war authorization for the global war on terror that was passed a week after 9/11. That war authorization is still in place. In 2002, a year after 9/11, Congress gave Bush a war authorization to invade Iraq. Senators and future Democratic presidential nominees, John Kerry and Hillary Clinton, said they voted to give George W. Bush the war authorization, but they said they didn't think Bush would use it. They thought he would be careful. They thought he would exhaust every diplomatic option and allow the weapons inspections to be finished before he led us into that illegal war. Hillary Clinton called voting for the Iraq War Resolution one of her biggest regrets. I'm guessing it's right up there with convincing Obama to bomb Libya and forgetting to campaign in Wisconsin and Michigan. The war authorization for Iraq was passed in October of 2002. Democrats controlled the Senate. Tom Daschle, Democrat, was the Senate Majority Leader. He could have blocked the war authorization. He could have stopped the war in Iraq. He didn't. And so in late March of 2003, Bush used that war authorization to illegally invade Iraq. That's how war works. It took 5 months from the time Congress gave Bush a thumbs up with that war authorization until he finally invaded. Wars never happen overnight. I keep telling you this. September 11th was 2001. George W. Bush didn't invade Iraq until March of 2003. There's time before you go to war. So it means you can debate. It means you can allow for weapons inspections. There's time for diplomacy. The third component of the War Powers Resolution of 1973 is if a president senses action must be taken immediately, like bombing Iran now, then the president must give Congress 48 hours notification beforehand. The thinking behind this is that would give Congress, if it so wished, 48 hours to pass a resolution blocking the president from launching the airstrike. What happened Saturday? We're hearing Trump informed Republican congressional leaders, but not Democratic leaders. So he obeyed the letter, but not the spirit of the law. He obeyed the letter of the War Powers Resolution, but not the spirit of the War Powers Resolution. The spirit of the War Powers Resolution is inform all of Congress. But most members of Congress can't be trusted to keep secret an attack that's about to take place in 48 hours. All it takes is one member of Congress who opposes the attack or is on Russia's payroll, and suddenly the attack plans are leaked. So, the spirit, not the letter, the spirit of the War Powers Resolution, how this has been done normally in the past since 1973, is presidents, before launching missile strikes, will contact what is called the Gang of Eight. The Gang of Eight. Those are the top 4 Democrats and the top 4 Republicans in Congress who can be trusted with top secret information. These are 8 members of Congress who have been thoroughly vetted by the FBI and have been given top security clearance to receive highly classified secret material. Somehow Devin Nunes ended up with it, and he became chairman of the Intelligence Committee during Trump's first term, during his first 2 years as president, Devin Nunes. So he would be Nunes would rush to the White House and tell Trump, here's what Mueller has on Russiagate, because he was chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. So he had access to all the investigations into Russiagate, and Nunes was rushing to the Oval Office to tell Trump what he had. Nunes then left Congress, and guess what he does now? He gets paid $1 million a year to run Truth Social. That's how he was repaid. A company that loses like hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every quarter. Devin Nunes gets paid $1 million a year. He was given top secret clearance to get classified material. Anyway, that's the Gang of Eight. You'll often hear them talk about the Gang of Eight. The Gang of Eight consists of the majority and minority leaders of both the House and the Senate. So that would be Speaker Mike Johnson, and Senate Majority Leader John Thune. They're the Republicans. They control the chambers right now, the Republicans. And the Gang of Eight also includes House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, as well as Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. They're the Democrats. Hopefully they'll be in control after the midterms. So that's 4. It's a Gang of 8. The other 4 are the chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. That would be Rick Crawford. He's the Republican. And the ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee is Democrat Jim Himes. That's 6. And then there's the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Republican Tom Cotton. And Mark Warner, he's a Democrat. He's the ranking member. There's your Gang of 8. And the spirit, not the letter, of the War Resolution Act, the War Powers Act, is those 8 should be consulted. Saturday, and 48 hours before Saturday, they were not consulted. At least the Democrats were not consulted. I'm not sure who among the Republicans was consulted, and the Republicans who weren't consulted would be too ashamed to tell anyone. But I would like some clarification from the courts as to what exactly the War Powers Resolution, or some people call it the War Powers Act. I would like some clarification from the Supreme Court to tell us what the War Powers Resolution dictates when it comes to congressional approval before a missile strike like Saturday night. The law specifies the president only had to notify the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem of the Senate. That's what it says in the War Powers Resolution. The President pro tem is the senior-most member of the Senate belonging to the majority party. That's a lot of words there. Let me say that again. The President pro tem is the senior-most member of the Senate belonging to the majority party. In other words, find the senator who's been there the longest, who's in the party that controls the Senate, make him the Senate, the President pro tem of the Senate. And right now that's Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa. Okay? I don't know if Trump contacted Chuck Grassley. Doesn't matter. I don't think Chuck Grassley would say anything. And I'm pretty sure he told Mike Johnson. But he certainly didn't tell the rest, none of the Democrats. So I would like clarification from the courts as to who in Congress the president must notify, because Congress passes a law, like in 1973, and laws evolve, and they require the courts to update them, short of Congress updating them, which, when it comes to the War Powers Resolution, I doubt we're going to see any action from Congress updating the War Powers Resolution. The letter of the War Powers Resolution is the president, the letter of the law says the president only has to contact the Speaker and the President pro tem of the Senate. That would be Mike Johnson and Chuck Grassley. But the spirit of that law, how it has evolved, dictates that the president include the Gang of Eight, because the Constitution says only Congress can declare war. I believe that was the original intent of the War Powers Resolution. Tradition after became consulting the Gang of Eight, but going before this Supreme Court, they would never want to take war-making powers away from our president. Had Hillary won in 2016, we would have a 6-3 majority in the court. And I doubt, because she was a hawk, I doubt her Supreme Court would want to take war-making powers away from the president. I mean, we have both Democrats and Republicans who want a robust and muscular executive branch, especially when it comes to foreign policy. I doubt we'll get any clarification on the War Powers Act anytime soon. So, do you think Iran was a national emergency? Because that's what the War Powers Act says. It says the president can only launch an attack, and he has to give Congress 48 hours notice when there's a national emergency, when he senses we're about to be attacked. Now, that is the law. It says you can only attack if there's an imminent threat. Do you think Iran was an imminent threat? This is why Donald Trump is a war criminal. Everybody agrees, including Donald Trump. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction. They were never going to attack the United States. According to Just Security International, now I'm going to talk about international law. Missile strikes, when it comes to international law, way more stringent than here in the United States. The UN Charter forbids missile strikes unless they are out of self-defense, and they must come with authorization from the UN Security Council. Occasionally, the UN will sanctify a missile strike or an attack. You might remember then Secretary of State Colin Powell went before the UN lying for a resolution that would authorize our illegal invasion of Iraq. We were turned down. The UN said, no, you can't go in there. Right there, Colin Powell, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, George W. Bush, international war criminals. According to the treaties we sign, if you go before the UN and offer evidence that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction and the UN says, no, they don't, and don't invade, and you invade, you are, by the letter of the law, a war criminal. It's not to be debated. Maybe you're for the war in Iraq, but the letter of the law is George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, Condi Rice are war criminals. Maybe you think it was a good idea to go in there. That doesn't mean they're not war criminals. So, Just Security, go read Just Security. They say the U.S. right now is in direct violation of of the international law because Trump failed to go before the UN with any evidence to justify Saturday's attack. He didn't bother to show evidence that Iran was an imminent threat. Why? Because it wasn't. That makes him a war criminal. Now, I know there are a lot of Democrats who say, I'm glad he did it. Maybe he was right for doing it. He's still a war criminal. The law is the law. Just Security says under international law, the United States might have been able to go before the UN claiming it was attacking Iran as part of some kind of joint security operation with Israel. But Israel never proffered that to the UN, especially since Israel's attacks on Iran are in violation of the UN Charter. There are, according to international law, two types of war. One type of war is barely legal. I'm not talking about the magazine Matt Gaetz writes for. One type of law is barely legal. The other type of war is completely illegal. So there's preemptive war and preventative war. Most of my listeners already know the difference between preemptive war and preventative war, but none of you can remember which is which. You know, because we haven't had this conversation since the Iraq War. Everybody remembers that there's preemptive war and preventative war, but nobody can remember which one is a war crime. Okay, preemptive war, while not entirely legal, is more legal than preventative war. Preemptive war. That's when a country attacks because it has incontrovertible evidence that an attack is imminent, and in order to preempt that attack, it attacks the country first before it gets attacked. It's really hard to prove that you're doing this preemptively, but you might even get an authorization from the UN for a preemptive war. That's what Colin Powell was trying to get when he lied before the UN in the lead up to the illegal invasion of Iraq. And he didn't get, the UN said this is not a preemptive war. An attack is not imminent. So, therefore, what we did when we invaded Iraq in March of 2003 is a preventative war, and that's illegal. Preventative war is illegal because it could have been prevented. What we did Saturday night was preventative war. That makes Donald Trump a war criminal. Preventative war is when George W. Bush or Donald Trump decides to start bombing because they see a future threat down the line. But the threat is not imminent. Iraq, clearly illegal. But Trump's attack on Iran was even more illegal. Even though more people died from Bush's Iraq attack, what Trump did Saturday night is more illegal. Mens rea is a legal term. It's Latin. It's a crucial component to establish criminal liability. It means guilty mind. What did the accused know when they committed the crime? And how much they knew determines how bad the crime is. If you know you're committing a crime, the guilt, the crime, and the punishment is far worse when you know you're committing a crime. It's why Donald Trump still insists the 2020 election was stolen, because mens rea. If he still insists, I believe the election was stolen, so that makes it harder to convict him of instigating an insurrection, because he genuinely believed the election was stolen. So he's never going to stop claiming the election was stolen because of mens rea. He's trying to convince future juries, I'm convinced it was stolen, because the minute a jury finds out the truth, that he knew it wasn't stolen, he has a guilty mind. Mens rea, guilty mind. So when it comes to mens rea, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney are less guilty believe it or not, than Donald Trump. What happened Saturday was more illegal, even though I don't know what the casualties were. I'm hoping none. But that was more illegal than George W. Bush and Dick Cheney's illegal invasion of Iraq, where, 1 million Iraqis ended up dead, thousands of soldiers, American soldiers died. Mens rea, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney can claim, it's bullshit, but they can claim they honestly believed they saw evidence to suggest Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Now, that evidence, they made it up. I mean, they would leak to Judith Miller, and then she would write it in the New York Times, and Dick Cheney said, look, the New York Times says there's weapons of mass destruction. If they were tried in The Hague, which they should be, there is enough of a paper trail that the George W. Bush administration established to suggest that while there weren't weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, they honestly thought there were. And therefore, the invasion of Iraq was a preemptive war as opposed to an illegal preventative war, because they looked at evidence that said Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat. Again, it would be a bogus argument. They should be imprisoned. Tony Blair should be in prison. They all saw evidence telling them there were no weapons of mass destruction. But you get a good lawyer, you might be able to convince The Hague we didn't have a guilty mind. Now compare that to what Trump did on Saturday. What Trump did is just a pure, unadulterated war crime. Trump's mens rea, his guilty mind, is he knew there was no imminent threat. He knew, everyone knew, Iran did not have weapons of mass destruction. Nobody knew if Iran was planning to build weapons of mass destruction. Nobody could agree on how close Iran was to being able to build a nuclear bomb if and when Iran ever decided to. The UN and Israel said if they ever decided to build a nuclear bomb, they could do it maybe in a month. And that was before Israel launched its missile attacks. Okay? By the time Donald Trump launched his missile attacks on Saturday, it was generally agreed that it was now a matter of 6 months to 3 years that Israel had set Iran's nuclear bomb-making capabilities back 6 months to possibly 3 years, if they wanted to make a nuclear bomb. If. So now Trump bombs on Saturday. That was preventative war. No threat was imminent. It was an attack to prevent a possible war somewhere down the line, and that is illegal. Okay? I hope I explained that. Something can be more illegal than, you can kill 1 million Iraqis, and that's illegal, but not as illegal as what Trump did Saturday night. That was more illegal. It's an open and shut case that Donald Trump is a war criminal for what he did Saturday night. And maybe you think, I don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Guess what? They don't. They don't have a nuclear weapon. So Republicans don't believe violating international law is an impeachable offense, unless Joe Biden did it. But it is an impeachable offense. It is against the law to violate international law because, first off, the United States, we are signatories to the UN Charter, which makes us subject to UN law. And when we violate international law, we are liable. Now, we're not signatories to the International Criminal Court, because if we were, all our presidents would be frog-marched before The Hague. But that doesn't mean Trump is innocent. As Just Security points out, there is the take care clause of the U.S. Constitution. You hear about the take care clause of the Constitution, which means the president swears an oath to take care of the laws. Article 2, Section 3 of our Constitution states that the president, quote, shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Those laws, according to Just Security, are domestic and international. The president of the take care clause of the Constitution says the president, according to Just Security, has to take care of international laws as well. Trump is now, by the letter of the law, officially a war criminal. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is now calling for Trump's impeachment because of Saturday's airstrikes. And you know how I know she's on legal footing? Rudy Giuliani responded to AOC by saying, anybody who calls for Donald Trump's impeachment after Saturday's airstrikes, quote, should be tried for treason. And who knows more about treason than Rudy Giuliani? I'm David Feldman, reminding you to stay strong and protect the weak. Thank you for listening to me. Please share this episode. I'm being throttled back by certain platforms. Please hit the like button. Please subscribe to my newsletter. Please subscribe to this channel. Thank you to Bob and Mila in the chat room. I read all your comments. And so leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Okay. Thank you for listening. I think that covers everything. I'm going to be doing a lot of shows. So I have an erratic schedule because I suffer from horrible insomnia. So there are days I want to do the show, but I haven't gotten any sleep, and it's not pretty. It never is pretty with me, but trust me. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.